along the way. I wonder if it's possible for other people to do this in other communities. That would be my hope anyway, is that, we do this locally and it has whatever effect it has locally. And I think it does have a real effect in our community, certainly bringing our religious leaders together in a meaningful way. And that obviously is what our intention was when we started. So that's a little bit of background of exploring the sacred here in Steamboat Springs. I guess, as usual, if you guys want to introduce yourself as we go around the horn. Karen, do you want to start? I guess, whatever, if you guys want.
I have been the leader of A Course in Miracles study group, the local one, for the past 24 years.
I'm Tim Olmsted with the Buddhist community.
Tim Selby at Heart of Steamboat United Methodist Church.
I'm Joanne Grace, and I serve as chaplain for hospice here in Steamboat Springs, and I attend St. Paul's Episcopal Church.
Scott, you got to unmute yourself.
You'd think I'd know better by now, wouldn't you? I'm Scott Siegel. I'm the rabbi for Har Mishpacha.
Great. Well, thank you, all of you, for being here. I appreciate those of you who are watching this evening, and then also those of you who are on the panel. Tonight's topic is righteousness versus religion. And we came up with this topic. Actually, we had one of our monthly meetings during the insurrection at the Capitol. And so while we were checking the news and watching that unfold during our meeting, we started to talk about how did we get here? First of all, how did our country get to be so divided? And this idea, the word righteousness, kind of kept coming up in the conversation. And I looked up the definition of righteousness and it's the quality of being morally right or justifiable. And it seemed to us that the kind of people on both sides, on all sides of these issues, feel righteous in their beliefs, feel like, that they have the right answer, that what they're doing is morally justifiable. So then it was like, well, what do we do with that? If both sides feel like that their position is morally justifiable, and that often takes precedent over the relationship that we have with people, the connection that we have with people, that what we think is right often supersedes that relationship piece. And so that's kind of where the conversation started for us. And so tonight, what we're going to be doing is exploring that, where this comes from, how we got to be where we are. And then hopefully by the end of the night, we'll have some ideas too about where to go from here, how we can heal this divide, how we can move forward as a country, as a community, and even individually in our own lives and families. So I'd like to start with the first question, and anyone feel free. Oh, Karen, did you
I just saw Father Ernest trying to get in.
Oh, okay, I'll pop him in here.
Okay.
So anyone can feel free to jump in here. I guess we'll let Ernest, I think he was listening, so he'll get it. Hi, Ernest.
You should keep him muted just to punish him for being late.
So sorry, I had an emergency that I couldn't get away from, so I'm sorry about that. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries.
Okay.
So you're just in time. We're starting with our first question. For those of you who don't know, this is Ernest Bayer. He is the priest at Holy Name Catholic Church. So the first question is, what do you guys think, what factors contributed to the division that you currently see in our country, politically, racially, economically? What do you think, how did we get here, basically? Feel free to jump in or I'll start calling on you.
Well, for me, I think fear is the greatest driver. Fear of change, fear of no change. I mean, when people start to get afraid, they sort of back up more into the known. And there's a lot going on right now that is out of people's control. So, you know, professionally as a psychotherapist, I see anxiety going up, and, you know, and when that sense of being out of control or unable to determine what the future looks like, you know, people try to grab control. They try to make it be the way they think it should, which can be the sort of precursor to a sense of righteousness, to being right and I know how it should be.
Mhm. Yeah, great. Thanks, Karen. What else? What other ideas do you guys have of how we got here? Fear being one of them?
Yeah, I agree with Karen. I mean, you know, when we're afraid, and there's so much that people are afraid of right now, you know, things are changing from climate change to political issues to people getting older and sicker, perhaps. You know, when we start constricting, fear causes us to constrict, and our mind gets very small and sort of tunnel vision, and we allow into that sphere of our attention our sort of tribe around us. And so even our affiliation with other humans gets smaller and smaller. And when that happens, then we just become splintered in you know, this huge sort of gathering of fear-based people who are constricted. And this is, and so the opposite, of course, where we have to go is we have to open that up, but we'll get to that.
Yeah, I would agree with both of your comments, and just, you know, and as everyone knows, we kind of live in this world that it becomes increasingly sort of siloed out, right? So like we watch the news that gives us what the perspective we want to have. We have friends and circles of people that reinforce those same views. So we tend to live in like little different worlds. And so and the more that happens, I think in the modern world that can happen more now than it could ever happen before. And so the more we live in like different worlds, the more that we see those who watch that other channel or have that other color or whatever it might be as the other. And you know, so they're not us, they're not one of us, they're not our people, they're somebody else. And so, and then it becomes really much more easy to divide ourselves and to feel like maybe those other people are not as smart as we are or less than we are. It's just really kind of a dangerous, slippery slope that way.
Yeah, so the othering that we do that comes out of that fear of I'm in my world, you're in your world, then it kind of becomes an us versus them. And I hear in that too, Tim, that idea that we just stop talking to each other. Like there's no communication, that we're just in our own little world. And they're in their own little world, and there's no connection there, communication.
And I'm good, you're bad.
Yeah,
I'm
yeah.
good, you're bad.
Mm-hmm.
You
That
know,
right?
and we all get painted as black and white, like, you know, like as it's just really, when I think most people are maybe much more alike than we think we are.
Mm-hmm.
I think there's also a fear element, Tim, when you said like, I'm smarter than you. It's like, I don't want to be the dumb guy. So I'm going to, you know, really put up my defenses to show that, you know, I'm not that person. I'm this person. I'm in with this camp and I'm with my clan here. So there's an interesting thing there of not necessarily being smarter, but being afraid of being an outsider and not being in the in crowd that is smart.
Actually, playing on that, did anybody listen to, I was listening to the news last night, and they were talking about that one of the reasons that there may have been less preparedness was that because the people that were supposedly protesting looked like us. You know, they were white, so they wouldn't be dangerous. And I thought that was very interesting, where they sort of said in the Black Lives Matter marches, since it didn't necessarily look like us, there could be a threat. And so it goes to color or whatever, where we perceive anything that looks like us, we're not a threat, so we don't perceive that people like us would be a threat. And so it's not just who's on the outside, but we may underestimate who's on the inside as well.
Yeah, I think to your point, Karen, one of the things I think it's important for us to remember is that, you know, when we talk about divisiveness, that for a long time and up until relatively recent history, that divisiveness was imposed upon various segments of the population by another segment of the population. And it seems that in a lot of these cases, what we see happening is that those who are seeking to minimize those divisions or eliminate those divisions are getting pushback from those who would like to see those divisions remain in place. I also think we are kind of societally susceptible to, I hate to use the word manipulation because it sounds so kind of evil and, you know, James Bondy, but manipulation from those who value power over all else, whether through social media, through advertising, through public rhetoric, all of that drives the divisiveness that we see and feel these days.
Yeah, it kind of makes sense that if people are afraid, that a response to that is to try to gather power as a, you know, to shield from the fear. Yeah.
I would also add to that, you know, every one of us here on this panel represents a religious tradition that would promote peace and treating other people with respect and dignity and equality and that sort of thing. But we're all coming from a religious perspective. And I think we probably need to acknowledge that our society is becoming more and more secular. There's fewer and fewer people being motivated from a religious perspective, some sense of a higher power, a supernatural power, a God, if you will. And so if you don't have that, then what's your moral authority? What is the moral authority that unites us all? If we don't have a God or a religious perspective, then we sort of are just making up our own morality. And if I decide to hate you or to harm you or to overpower you, there's no other authority above me that is saying that's wrong. And so I think to some extent, this is a symptom of the fact that our society is becoming more secular, less religious.
Although I think, you know, religion has also served as a decidedly divisive element, both in this country and worldwide for the last, I don't know, 10,000 years, something like that. And so, you know, while I agree that your religion, and this is kind of, you know, here's the rub, is that religion can play a role in bringing people together, but it really depends on, you know, how we're understanding our religious traditions, you know, our willingness to be open to others having systems of belief or practice that vary differently, that are even antithetical to ours. And I think, you know, that's a hard thing for a lot of people to kind of to get to, is a willingness to say, I 100% think that your way of doing this is wrong, but you do you, and we can be cool, and it's all good. But that's a hard step for, I think, for a lot of people to take, to kind of have that level of self-awareness and to be comfortable enough with your own self, with your own practice, with your own religious tradition, that you can live in it comfortably, even in conversation with, even in relationship with those whose religious views or worldviews or practice may be, again, vastly different, or even kind of in contrast, or in kind of antagonistic even to your own.
And again, that's why we started this group. I mean, and that's exactly why we did. It's, you know, it wasn't any less divisive in 2003 when the Gulf War was raging, and we were trying to figure out, like, how do we have all these religions who aspire to the golden rule and want to treat each other justly and respectfully, and yet here we are, we're blowing each other away. Like, I feel like I don't know, I keep coming back to, like, do we do this, is it more effective to do this on a community level in our, you know, in our little neighborhoods, or is, you know, is there a way to do it in a more national or worldwide way? But to your point, Scott, this stuff's been going on for thousands of years. Like, this is nothing new.
And I would like to suggest from that perspective, it's nothing new, that within the human being, that instinct basic human instinct in terms of the fear factor is really that instinct to protect. And we're going to protect our own. And that's just the primal brain working. I think in the nature of, how did we get here? Maybe just part of the human condition. And maybe the movement is to learn. It's like, as you suggested, can we step away from it? Scott suggests, can we step away from it and understand different people's perspectives so that fear doesn't dominate anymore, but has the capacity to create a protection for everybody.
To get back to Ernest, here's my question to you. So if it's important that people have a spiritual tradition, it seems to me that is either wonderful or really, really bad. And this is where the righteousness comes through. So if you have a spiritual tradition, or the tradition, the way it's being presented to you, whatever, you know what I mean, is exclusionary, is fear-based, is tribal, then the follow-on assumption is that I have God on my side. And so it sort of escalates that arrogance. And I think that's a lot of the problem. I think that's the righteousness part. I don't think this is I don't blame our traditions for this. I blame the way that it's being interpreted to, congregations.
Interpreted by people that have insecurity, so that they feel like I must be right and therefore you must be wrong. And if you're wrong, I have the right to whatever, sideline you or alienate you or worse. So I think it's kind of rooted in an insecurity that, I have to be right. I can't handle not being right. And if you disagree with me, then you must be wrong. And that leads to exclusivism, which I think is just rooted in an insecurity and a lack of openness to the fact that God could be bigger than I imagine him to be. God could be working in you as well as me, and to have that mutual respect and openness, that takes humility.
It may not be as conscious as I'm right and you're wrong. From a course's perspective, the problem comes when you start to identify yourself with your belief system, whether that's religious or political, so that anybody that thinks differently than you do is actually attacking you, is actually a threat on your sense of self. And then it becomes much more primitive. You're willing to go, as Joanne was saying, this then becomes sort of biological. I'm going to defend, what I believe, because anybody that doesn't believe the way I do is actually a threat. It's not just I'm right and you're wrong. They're threatening me by threatening how I see things. And from the course is actually there to have you question that, to have you question your identification with your belief system and recognize that who you are is, you can make it what you think, or you can liberate yourself from that and realize we can think anything, but that doesn't necessarily define us. So we don't have to perceive people who think differently as a threat.
Yeah, so you guys are kind of moving into this next question too. Most of you have talked about this concept of us versus them. And Joanne, you were kind of talking about that idea that we have to protect our own first, or Karen, the idea that we identify with our group and it feels like a threat if somebody is different. So how do we start to move out of that? Like, what would even be the motivation? Again, like if the idea is like, I'm safer in my own group, I'm protecting my own, why would somebody want to move out of that? Or how do we move past that? How do we ourselves motivate ourselves or in others?
I'll jump in and just follow on what I was saying. And that is, the motivation is when you get tired of living in anger, judgment, and fear. Because what we've been talking about so far will keep moving us back into that sort of small area where anything different from us is perceived as a threat. And that's a lot of angst to go through life with. So if we want to experience peace, if we want to experience a sense of safety, we've got to move out of the way we've been thinking or perceiving our neighbor.
I think there's also an element of that we need to recognize or help kind of collectively understand that, you know, when we, a lot of these things that we're talking about, especially when we get into issues of kind of justice and those things that aren't tangible, that it's not a zero-sum game. You know, and even with the things that are tangible, it's not a zero-sum game. You know, one person or one group getting more doesn't necessarily mean that someone else, that you or someone else gets less. That, you know, it's not, you know, it's not like a pie that's a finite amount that once all the slices are gone, you know, too bad, so sad. That it's something that is beyond that, and we can help each other, you know, get where we want to go. And we don't have to, it doesn't require us to really sacrifice for that. I think there's this idea that in order for, you know, group A to get where they want to go, group B has to give up something, and it just isn't the case. You know, group A can get what they, you know, what they need, and group B can still have what they need, and everyone can you know, can go on living their happy life. But we kind of get inundated with this idea that, you know, someone or some group, you know, achieving automatically means you know, that someone else or some other group has to be diminished. And as long as we're kind of in that space, we're going to continue to operate as Tim Olmsted was talking about, to continue to operate out of a place of fear, of you know, fear of loss of what we have or loss of what we might have, rather than out of a recognition that, what is the, you know, rising tide lifts all ships kind of thing. And so, you know, but that's hard to do because, you know, fear sells, fear gets, you know, campaign donations, fear gets, you know, people elected to places. And as long as that continues to be the case, it's going to continue to be used towards that end, the acquisition of power, and then to use that power to divide in such a way that benefits, you know, those in charge.
Tim Selby, what do you have to say about this?
You know what's running through my head a little bit is that sense of it's in the title. We have righteousness and relationship. What do you want to live in? You want to be righteous, or do you want to be in a relationship with people? Right? I mean, I think that's like, at first blush, that's a really easy question for me. I want to be in a relationship with people, but sometimes our pride, our ego, our moral correctness, or whatever can get in the way of that. You know, I feel blessed that, you know, I have some beautiful, wonderful, lifelong friends who think really differently than I do. And we can, you know, we can converse around that, and argue and give each other a hard time and push each other's buttons or whatever, and then tell each other we love each other at the end of that. And it's such a grounding thing for me, because it so often reminds me the people that have different views than I do, they're like, I'm not smarter than they are. I don't care more about people than they do. I don't want a good future and they want a bad future for the, like, it just kind of breaks all that down. I think relationship, that piece in our title is so key. Like if we stay in relationship, we'll find our commonality, we'll find our goodness, we'll find, you know, what was instructive to me, I don't want to go on too long, but was in the kind of the gun issues that we dealt with. I mean, we still deal with, but we're kind of hot button issues a little while back. There was a school shooting, and everyone's brokenhearted by a school shooting, right? So like we have this commonality of brokenheartedness at a school shooting, and then we all want better. We all want safety for our kids. We all want, you know, so we're bound by our experience of the pain, and we're bound by our hope for the future. In the middle, we might get separate. Like, I think we should have school guards, or somebody thinks we should have, you know, like no gun. It all kind of goes different ways, right? But we lose track of, like, we share this common pain and this common hope for the future. So let's not get too lost in the middle, and let's realize that we share our pain, we share our hope for a great future, and let's find our way through the middle of that without making each other the enemy. Because the enemy of a school shooting isn't the person that maybe thinks different than you, right? That's not the enemy. The enemy is violence that kills kids. And so let's not get lost in the middle of that.
I like that, Tim. I feel like that comes back to the heart of it, is like we all want to intellectualize things and say that we're right because we're smarter, we have a better idea. But underlying all of it is that common ground, our common humanity. And the news media is classic. They're great at like dividing us and trying to intellectualize why this is the right way to do things, or this is the right way to do things, completely leaving out the common ground of we're all humans trying to be happy. Like there's no space in the news media for trying to celebrate that shared humanity. I feel like that's the real tragedy of our time, is that there is we're trying to be too smart for each other.
Mhm, mhm.
Actually, there is room in the news media, and that's when there's a disaster and everybody helps his neighbor. And in a disaster, whether it's a tornado or a flood or whatever, you don't have people asking what side of the aisle are you sitting on or what your religion. People dive in and help, and we see it all the time.
I don't think we do in the media. I think we see that short for a brief snippet of time when that tragedy happens, and then there's a shooting, and then all of a sudden it's we're off to the races of, do we have more guards, do we have guns, blah blah blah. But that moment of shared humanity is so small, and that's to me is the tragedy. Like I agree, Karen, that there's plenty of tragedy that should bring us together, but it's a nanosecond in the whole story in the news.
I've been wondering, Tim's comment about, do you want to be right or do you want to be relational? And all of a sudden I began wondering, it's like sort of like the instinct, there's an instinct in us to compete. There's also a movement to cooperate. So I'm just wondering if that instinct, it biologically also doesn't come into play, in the sense of, can one wonder a little bit about, is righteousness about competition in that instinct way? Or can we say that then the relational component is about cooperation? And it's hard to get into cooperation without sometimes the fear factor. And so even in the fear factor, there's a sense of awe and there's a sense of terror. So it's sort of the paradigm of the paradox of it all keeps me wondering that maybe they're all happening at the same time.
I think that's a great question. Like, I think our instinct is to protect, is to get our own, to gather, to, to turn inward, because that's how things survive. I think one of the great parts about, I think all of our religious traditions is they invite us to a different, to the next evolutionary step, to where my goal is not to just protect my food, but it's to share it. It's not just to conserve my energy, but to serve. It's not just to protect my life, but to give it away. And it's funny because it's so often that our traditions that invite us to take this next step in the evolutionary process, I think, so often get used to turn us back the other way, and get used in exactly the opposite way. Instead of opening us up to more and to more relationship, they turn us inward to kind of, I think, what you're talking about there, Joanne.
This goes back to what Scott was saying, though, and that is, if it's natural to be competitive and to watch out for your own, then you've got to point out how mutually working together goes beyond the zero-sum game. Instead of me just protecting my plot of land, if I put my plot with somebody else's, maybe it's not just 2 times the outcome, maybe it's 4. And I think there is, what Scott was talking about, the motivation is we've got to start seeing how, it's not I'm giving up and giving you something, but that in cooperation, we actually double, triple, quadruple what we can produce and do. It's actually much more beneficial to share and work together than it is to back up and just protect my own.
I keep coming back in my mind to this fabulous quote about mutuality. This comes from Martin Luther King. It's a well-known quote. He said, "We are tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, and whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I mean, I think maybe it's easy to say, hard to pull off, but I think we need to upgrade our thinking. It's what you're saying. If we don't understand that we really rise and fall together, that we're completely interdependent. My well-being depends on yours. My life has been given by someone else, the heat in the room, the clear sky. We need to begin to open up and experience the fact that we are a web of being, and when one goes down, what affects the other affects me. So we just somehow need to get beyond our tribal mentality and begin to think of ourselves as the human family, finally, for once. In other words, just make the tribe so big that we're all part of one tribe.
That's a beautiful quote. It reminds me of there's another one. I don't know what from a physicist. I don't know which one, but he says, as soon as you try to take one thing out of the universe, you find it's connected to every other thing. You know?
John Muir, the conservationist.
Oh, is that John Muir?
Yeah.
Not a physicist,
Yeah.
but a smart guy.
Yeah.
I think it also reminds me of the statement from Francis of Assisi, where it is in giving that we receive. You know, just if we could make that paradigm shift, if I step out of my comfort zone and help you, I'm going to be blessed in some way. I'm going to be happier. I'm going to have life more abundantly because I'm loving my neighbor. You know, if we can just make that shift rather than thinking I got to hoard it all for myself, because we're all looking for happiness in life. And like you were saying, Tim Selby, if you give it away, you actually, in some sort of paradoxical way, you feel more alive when you're connecting and serving and giving to someone else. And that's a mystery. It takes trust, you know, to step into that and trust it. But when we do that, we feel more alive. It's kind of a paradox, you know.
I think Mother Teresa said the problem is that we've forgotten that we belong to each other.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Mm.
So so kind of all these great wisdom pieces are saying the same thing, right?
Mm.
That we're in this together.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there is a place for righteousness. You know, I'm just thinking, you guys are talking about Martin Luther King, and I'm thinking civil rights issues. Like, is there a place, you know, as religious leaders, as people of faith, as just humans on this earth, that we do need to be righteous, where we do need to stand up and say, no, this is morally right, or this or what you're doing is morally wrong. Like, again, we're talking about how it divides us, but I'm also wondering if there is a place for it. Do we need righteousness?
Marshall, read your definition of righteous before we answer this.
The quality of being morally right or justifiable. So it kind of brings into question, is there a morally right?
Right, I was going to say, what's the difference between following a moral code and believing you're morally right?
Well, I think this is where it becomes like, you know, what we call a flatland sometimes. If everyone believes they're morally right, what does it even mean anymore? You know, if white supremacy if they think that that's morally right, you know, again, how do we define what's morally right? And is there a line when we should really stand up for what's morally right?
I think that righteousness, if by righteousness what we mean is that we're really clear that we're right, there is a wisdom that we have. There is a place for that if it's backed by wisdom. If it's just anger sharpened into a blade, then it hurts everybody. But there are principles. I think we agree as people, as part of spiritual communities, that there are common principles that bind us as humans. And wanting to help is deep compassion, but we need wisdom to apply that appropriately. And there's no problem from the Buddhist point of view. There's no problem with being angry. It's when that turns destructive, when it's mixed with hatred. But anger without hatred can be incredibly wise and incredibly profoundly effective. So yeah, we would say there is room for righteousness if you're wise enough to actually see what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah,
I think,
exact same
go
thing.
ahead.
In the scriptures, that for us is the term "be angry and sin not," right? But anger, yeah, right? Like anger at injustice, anger at harm, at violence, at many things. So yeah, I think to Marcia's question, yeah, I mean, there's a point like in our tradition, like so we trace back to the Judeo-Christian tradition, right? Going back to that prophetic tradition, where there's a lot to say no to. There's a lot of injustice to say no to get in the way of injustice and pain and violence inflicted upon other human beings. Yeah, and to be angry about that, yes, but to live in a way that enhances life and doesn't diminish life.
I mean, I think one other thing to consider when we're talking about morality is that, and this actually goes back to kind of circles back to something Ernest was saying earlier, but sadly, Ernest, I'm disagreeing with you. You know, I think we tend to think of morality as some kind of like overarching, ubiquitous concept, when, you know, if we look at our history and the history of kind of ethics and ethical development, I mean, morality is a social construct. You know, what is considered moral, it, you know, varies from society to society, from kind of period to period. Things that were considered absolutely moral and great, you know, even 20, 30 years ago, are things that are not considered that today. And so, you know, the morals, we control what the morals are. We can control by how we act, by how we interact, by the way we kind of live out, what the morals of a society become. You know, they are guided by religious traditions and you know, as well as many other sources. But when it comes down to the actual implementation of those morals, it's on us, it's on society to determine what is just and what is right. And I think we need to be a little careful about getting caught up in kind of the question of morals, and maybe we would benefit kind of, again, societally, from a shift to the kind of the laws, the policies, the kind of the way those morals are implemented in society. You know, because the morals can kind of be loose and vague and shifting, but you know, how these ideas, how these concepts are reflected in the systems that we create, or the systems that we give power to, is something that's much more tangible and maybe much kind of easier to wrap our heads around. It's something that's concrete that we can say, okay, you know, this practice, this law, this whatever, is harming a lot of people. So, you know, and, you know, could we justify it in some way, shape, or form? Yeah, you know, the reality is, if we're clever enough, we can justify just about anything. And so the question becomes, what is actually happening on the ground? Are these morals really truly expressed in what we see happening on a day-to-day basis? And if they're not, then how do we make that happen? And if we think they are, and there's still all these problems and all these issues, then maybe we have to come back and say, okay, we thought that this kind of sense of morality that we have was a good one, but we're seeing as it's playing out, we're seeing that it's not working the way we thought it would. So maybe we should go back and kind of rethink how we understand this particular issue or this particular question, and kind of then start from there to reframe and take it forward.
So I want to jump in and answer your question, Marshall. I'm not too sure righteousness is really ever justified, because I think with what Scott was saying is righteousness comes sort of from our head, what we believe, and that sort of moral thing that Scott was talking about, or that Tim, is really dropping into the heart, is coming from compassion and connection, and Tim Selby was talking about relationship. We don't create relationship through intellectual, you know, it's done through the heart. And so I think we're talking about two different things. You know, righteousness is in our head, and relationship is more in our heart.
So
one
I would
message.
say,
Go ahead, Joanne. Go ahead.
I'm just wondering, and Scott, help me out here a little bit, that I think there is a place for righteousness, but I think it depends on sort of the assumption that we make. Out of a Greek worldview, righteousness is about that law, about morality, about how we put that into action, what's right, what's wrong. And my understanding, and again, Scott, I would lean on you a little bit here in terms of that Hebrew understanding. It seems to me that righteousness is about putting things in right relationship.
I mean, I think that is a way that could be conceived. Righteousness within the context of Judaism is usually identified as kind of following in, adhering to God's will, following God's footsteps, that kind of thing. That is what makes a person righteous. The tricky part is trying to figure out, what exactly God is trying to get us to do. Because there's lots of books, but those books aren't always as helpful as we might want. But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the talk about righteousness within the context of Judaism does end up being connected to relationship, not even necessarily the one-on-one interpersonal relationship, but just kind of a relationship within community that, whether it's, talking about the caring for, the trope that's always used, the widow, the orphan, those who are unable to care for themselves, that is something that's righteous. And, helping someone, there's a great biblical phrase about, if you see your enemy's, ox fallen over, you have to go over and help him lift it up, right? So it's kind of recognizing that, as was being said before, we are all part of one kind of giant moving organism. And that because of that, righteousness does obligate us to be in relationship with people in a way that is supportive and understanding and critical when necessary, but that kind of is tries to accept not only the person, but kind of the whole as something to be valued and something to be worked with and for.
Thank you.
Sounds like you're saying that relationship is righteous.
That's my understanding just from the reading of scriptures in terms of just our biblical understanding.
What keeps coming to my mind is one little line from Jesus where he says, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness." So what does that mean? Kingdom of God, wherever God rules, wherever God gets his way, wherever God's values are respected or whatever. And as you say, Scott, it's, what does that mean? What is God like? I think through the Judeo-Christian tradition, God's revealed as loving, caring for the alien, concerned about justice, mercy, forgiveness, service, and all that. And so I think that's some of the objective truth about morality. I think the whole universe, the whole human race is created to sort of tap into that or to figure that out, that we're called to relationship, we're called to love, we're called to mercy and forgiveness, we're called to honesty, mutual respect. These are all things that you could say are attributes of God. And if God's reigning in a kingdom where everyone's obeying God's laws, I think it would be a kingdom of love and mutual respect and, treating people with dignity and service and all of that, all of those basic principles that are revealed, at least in the Judeo-Christian tradition, and if not in the other traditions. There's got to be something universal about it, about this call to just do the right thing. And it has to transcend all of our differences. I think there's just got to be some sort of an objective morality. That's what our tradition would propose. And we're all trying to figure that out.
I'd like to read in the chat, Angie has put down, righteousness has all to do with the heart. People trying to just be right for their own sake is a self-righteousness, but it is not true for righteousness. True righteousness has all to do with how to love and honor others. perhaps there is a bit of confusion between the words right and righteousness. That was kind of an interesting point.
You know, going back a little bit to what Karen was saying about the head or the heart, as leaders of congregations and you know, a mouthpiece, then it's really upon us, I think, to make sure that we're always speaking in part to the heart. Because if we're always trying to be theologically perfect, or you know, crank our communities up to think somehow they're better with all these things here, and not speak to the heart, then we're actually contributing to the problem.
Yeah, and it seems like religions do often fall into that, right? Like the idea that my faith is right. If you do what we say, it's right. That kind of confusion that we were just, I think Angie mentioned, between righteousness versus what is right. But yeah, the kind of, we know what's right, we're better, the one up, one down, and then we move into that us and them, and it moves us out of relationship and back into the us versus them mentality.
But I don't think it is like all, you know, when you net out, get to the bottom of all religions, it's kind of all about the golden rule. And so to say that it is, they all divide, you know, it's like, I think it's individual preachers or teachers within individual religions, you know, it's the one that I've told this story too many times about. Ram Dass talked about meeting people in all these different religious traditions, and the ones at the top that just accept their religion and recognize the love and connection to a higher power. And then the people below them that are trying to, they're not quite sure about their religion. So they need to like kind of proselytize and get people to see that their way is right. That is where the problem comes in. You know, we're getting away from recognizing again that shared humanity, and the farther away we get, the more divided we become.
So before we open it up to the audience for questions, which we'll do here in just a few minutes, I wonder if each of you could just share what you would say would be kind of some guiding principles that would lead us from that sense of righteousness more into relationship. Like, what would we be doing? What would we need to keep in mind to shift from that righteous mentality more into connection with others?
I think for me, the guiding principle would to understand deeply the fact that everybody wants what we want. We're completely aligned in wanting, you know, to be okay, to be safe, to be happy, to flourish. We're all afraid of the same thing. And the guiding principle then would be, if we understood that, then we would act from that point of view. We would act in a way that is keeping in mind the greater whole, and understanding that, you know, it's the great whole. It's all of us that have to flourish for any one of us to flourish.
Great. And real quick, before the rest of you jump in, I was just going to say, for those of you who are listening, if you have questions, now would be a good time. If you could put them in the Q&A as opposed to the chat, then it might help me sort through what's just a comment versus a question. And then if anyone would actually like to speak, feel free to, I think you can raise your hand, and then I can enable you to speak if you would like to verbally ask your question. And if you'd rather just have one of us read it, you can put it in the Q&A. But while the leaders are answering, feel free to start dropping your questions in.
So for me, I think following on what Tim just said, I mean, and going back to where we started the discussion, if the reason we shrink back into our groups is fear, if the reason that we cling to our beliefs is fear, then I think maybe it would be helpful not to interpret attack coming from somebody who thinks differently, but that they're, as Tim was saying, they're in fear as well. So I think one of the ways is to just listen. Mm-hmm. This goes with what Tim Selby was talking about. What's going on? And they may look at a problem They may have it differently. They may have a different lens that they're seeing life or other in, but listen. And I think, I mean, for me personally, if I've listened enough, I start to understand where that fear is, or where that universality is, where the connection. We may look at solving that fear different ways, but as you know, we've got that, and so if we just stay open, if we just hear and listen, I think for me it's a huge step towards creating relationship, and with relationship and keeping the conversation open, you know, you can reach those solutions that Scott was talking about, you know, that are mutually beneficial.
And I totally agree. And I would add to that, just, you know, listen to them explain their position. If it's somebody that believes differently than me or thinks differently than me, I try to let them explain their position, but then also why. Like, why do you feel that way about that? What has gone on in your life that led you to that understanding, so that I can have a better understanding of where they're coming from and why they arrived at that conclusion, which is different from my conclusion, but to help understand why. You know, their life experience, and that's building the relationship. And then that, to me, that would lead to more respect that I would have for them. Like, okay, now I understand where you're coming from. I understand why you got there. And I understand a little bit more why we're different, but we're still striving for the same goals, or trying to do what we think is right. But I think listening, taking the patience and the humility to listen and hear the why behind their conclusion.
Great.
And somebody just put up a chat, and I just wanted to, there's listening to get the information so you can defend your point of view, and there's listening with curiosity. You know, what's really behind, what's that person thinking, what's going on? So I think curiosity is a big part of it.
Yeah, that's a really good point, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I agree, Karen. I think too often, you know, no, we don't really listen to each other. We're just formulating what we're going to say while somebody else is talking, which, you know, doesn't get as much of anywhere.
What else? Any other kind of guiding principles that you would offer?
I think I liken it to the nature of when there is, if we're all standing around a circle as one, and someone shares an experience from their part of the circle, from their perspective, and I'm standing maybe on the opposite part of the circle, it's like, it's a different perspective. So it's the curiosity is, how do I move over to that person's perspective to really comprehend it or understand it from that? So I think my guiding principle would be the nature that I would say, you are me, I am you, and we are we.
I would maybe throw in, you know, we talk about sometimes things being tribal. And yeah, things get and you know, and there's a point where like tribes are awesome, you know, like tribes are people, tribes are how you survive, tribes are where you live your life, tribes are what give you tradition and meaning and purpose. I think so I think we all want to, like to Tim's list earlier, we all want to belong, right?
Right.
We want to belong somewhere. But hopefully we can achieve the wisdom to understand our belonging to our tribe or our football team or our whatever we're really into. That can be a beautiful thing, but it doesn't make us the enemy of where somebody else belongs. We can hear about what is so beautiful about where they belong and what that has taught them and what that has gifted them. Then we learn from each other. Our belonging doesn't have to be over and against other people's belonging.
Yeah, that's great. Thanks, Tim.
And I think one of the, you know, as I've been listening to everyone, one of the things where I feel I differ a little bit, I think, is I don't always necessarily think that we have to try and, you know, understand everyone else's perspective. I think sometimes it's enough to just acknowledge that their perspective is different than ours, and to be okay with that. You know, and there are some issues or some questions where it is really necessary for everyone to kind of get on the same page, or at least find some sort of common ground. But sometimes there's not, and sometimes it's okay for people to kind of, remain on, different sides of a fence. And the real challenge, I think, is, can we stay on those sides of the fence and be comfortable with that, and not feel like we have to try and move our fence into the other person's space, or they're not trying to move their fence into our space. I guess my guiding, at the end of the day, my guiding principle, to borrow extraordinarily loosely from the medical profession, they're the do no harm. Don't be a jerk. Be nice to people. Understand that we're all, at the end of the day, most of us are just trying to get to the same place. We want to be able to live a life that feels meaningful, live a life where we have health, and we have people who we love and care about. And if we can kind of keep that in mind, and just make sure we're trying our best to make sure we're not actively doing things to harm others, whether in the way we act, in the way we speak, I think that could go a long way. And once maybe we kind of get, we all kind of collectively, simmer down a little bit, and understand that it's not this kind of constant battle for, supremacy or superiority or anything else, for right or righteousness, or whatever we want to end up calling it, that we can, then we can start to say, okay, we really are kind of all in this together. And now let's see if we can figure something out that works for everyone. And maybe we'll find some way that everyone can kind of be okay with where things are at. Doesn't mean everyone's going to be perfectly happy or, horribly upset, but what do people say about compromise sometimes? That if at the end of the day, both parties are kind of like, then it was probably a good compromise.
I think that's a slippery slope, Scott. I guess I would disagree with you, because I feel like that's where we are today, is that we kind of let people have their point of view, even if they're, take a white supremacist as an example, like, you let them kind of, I don't know. I think there's a point at which, not in a judgmental way, but like to understand why they got to that point of view, I think is how we grow as humans. I think of like our kids. I don't want my kid to like put that kid in a, like in a silo over here, like that kid is a white supremacist or whatever the example might be. They believe this view, and so I'm going to just kind of leave them, and I'm not going to upset the apple cart. I think that can lead to stagnation, and we all kind of just like almost turn a blind eye to the elephant in the room of we're not recognizing our shared humanity. I mean, that's really the goal to me, is like, how do we teach our children to recognize our shared humanity?
I think you make a really good point. I think that the kinds of issues where that really comes into play are relatively few and far between, though. And for many of the kind of questions and issues that we encounter on the daily, in our conversations with each other, and our conversations with people in our communities and congregations, and just out in the world, although less so since we're not really going places these days. But is those kinds of things are generally questions or issues where I think we can be comfortable saying, you know what, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. I do think that you're absolutely right. When we get into some of these kind of higher level issues, like with racism or gender discrimination, or some of that kind of stuff, that is a different conversation. So I think that's a really good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'd like to just recap quickly all of the guidelines you offered, because I think they were pretty good. So some of the things that I heard in there were to listen, to recognize that everybody wants to be happy and avoid suffering, to understand the why of the other, how people get to where they are, to have curiosity, the we from Joanne, that the other isn't necessarily an enemy. You know, Tim Selby talked about it's okay to have a tribe, but it doesn't mean that they have to be the bad guy. And how we can just acknowledge and accept differences too, that we don't always have to agree, that we can agree to disagree sometimes respectfully, and do no harm in that. So those are kind of the guidelines laid out. And now I'd like to move to questions. So this first one from Marie: how do we work towards healing when we have different perceptions of what is true, not just in different religions, but also different sources of information or different versions of events, for example, in relation to what happened at the Capitol? Good question.
How do we lead to healing if we have different versions of what's true?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's a great question, Marie. Thank you. And I was thinking about that today, actually. You know, like that. That as we get in different worlds of what's true, it becomes more difficult. I was thinking about, for example, like if you were a Hillary Clinton fan and you thought Russia interfered with the election, okay. But if there's no way to sort of like prove that or quantify that or do something with that, then you got to kind of deal with reality as it is. And then if you're a Donald Trump fan and you think that the election was tampered with, okay. But unless there's some way to prove that or quantify that, then you got to kind of like, at some point, there has to be some commonality of reality. I don't know how you do it if there's not a commonality of what's real. And that's such a great, I don't have an answer to the question. I think it's a great question. I wanted the exact same thing.
Yeah, it
I
seems to
I mean,
me
I
with-
think
Go on.
Go ahead.
Unfortunately, sometimes we only really get together at times of calamity. And unfortunately, that it seems to be the case when things are really, really terrible, we know to come together. We've had the luxury of being able to sustain this amount of separateness for some time now, but I don't know. What does it take? Another world war? I mean, I don't know.
And we talked about that. You'd think maybe a pandemic would bring people together.
Yeah.
We're gonna wait for that not to happen.
Yep. The only thing we got left is that Martian invasion.
hey, there was a UFO spotted flying over Arizona or something, right? The FBI
Right,
just
our
said
hope.
something about that.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, it'll be interesting to see as we come out of this pandemic what we find the lasting effects, if any.
You know, I think the only way to answer the question of what happens when we're dealing with different, I would call it realities, because the facts are the facts, but is that sometimes, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking politically or what side of that aisle or religion or whatever, sometimes our need to justify our beliefs is what creates our attachment to certain ways of looking at things. So I still think we've got to come back through the curiosity and understand how a person's thinking, or we're not even going to be able to create enough of a conversation to be talking about the same facts. I mean, I was having a conversation a while back with somebody who had a different version of the facts, but when we sat down, and it was like, but are you believing all of that? And it was like, no, not all of it. And where were we actually closer in how we understood what was really happening? And again, so I think it still takes conversation. It isn't just sort of saying, well, you've got your facts and I've got mine. It's like, really, let's open this up and have a hard conversation, as Tim Selby was saying with his friends. I think we've gotten scared of talking to each other.
Yeah.
And somebody said, and I can't remember if it was in our last meeting, when did we get so frightened of talking to each other that instead of talking to our neighbor about a disturbance, we just call the police? Why aren't we trying to resolve these things on our own? Why don't we communicate? So I think I think it starts with that relationship thing where we were talking about. Instead, just having a conversation, reaching out, trying to understand the person.
I would
I
second
think there's
that.
also a question of, oh, so go ahead.
I think we should be careful that we don't not leave time for other questions. So
Okay.
That's okay. Tim. I
there's a
mean,
lot of questions, I think, in the line.
yeah, there's actually a lot of comments, but we don't have a lot of questions.
Okay.
So again, if people have questions or if you want to ask a question, feel free to raise your hand or put it in the Q&A.
But I do agree, Karen. I think this is a really important topic. Like, you know, the fact that we can't communicate, we're afraid to talk to our neighbor. It's just, it's crazy. You know, like I feel like, and Joanne, maybe you can weigh in on this. I feel like what allows us to have that conversation oftentimes is death. Somebody dies and all of a sudden it's like everything else gets stripped away. And now we can talk to that neighbor. I feel like it's tragic that, you know, we all go home and watch our news programs, whatever they might be, and we're afraid to talk to each other.
Well, I think it brings
That's where mutuality and common ground starts, is a conversation. Like doesn't need to be about what's right and wrong. It's just like, show me some of your humanity.
Mhm. And I think death, that's the kind of the point at which it puts into real light the life cycle that we're in, that at any point in time we could experience that ourselves. And so I think in that, then there is a conversation, you know, how can I support you? What can I do to make a difference for you? And on the other hand, there's people that just, when that occurs, it's like they disappear.
Mhm.
So I think you've got people on both sides of the equation that are there, you know, and understanding the common humanity of our life death cycle, and others it's like, I can't deal with it, it's too much.
Mhm.
And I've kind
I
of
want
been
to do
wondering.
sorry.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, I think when we talk about, you know, the question that was asked about healing, I think it's important to consider what do we mean when we say healing? You know, I think about it in terms of like when we talk about peace, you know, there's like, they talk about like a cold peace and a warm peace, right? And so, you know, are we talking about like a cold healing where everyone just kind of learns to tolerate each other just enough to, you know, manage? Or are we talking about a warm peace, you know, or warm healing where there's actually kind of a free flow of ideas and a willingness to listen and a willingness to change that allows us to collectively kind of evolve to something more? I mean, I think, you know, I wonder if one is necessary before the other, that, you know, you have to have the cold healing before you can get the warm healing. If that's a necessary step, or if we could kind of just skip that and get to the good stuff. But it may be that, at least, you know, to start, a cold healing is enough to like get us on the path moving forward to something beyond where we are right now.
Well, that was kind of my wondering too, Scott, was like, well, what is healing? We each probably from our different worldviews have an understanding of what that would be. And then how are we going to recognize it when it happens?
I suppose healing could be one of two things. It could be we both now agree, we've worked through our differences and we've come to an agreement, or we both now fully understand each other's position and we respect each other. You know, we agree to disagree, but we respect each other and we understand each other. That could be healing as well, I guess. You know, or we admit that maybe I don't have all the facts. Maybe you know more about this than I do, you know. I don't know if you want to read the question again, Marshall, because it was a while ago. I know it was a kind of a long question.
Yeah,
There was
that's
a little bit more to it.
Yeah, I think we can move on.
Okay.
Somebody was asking a question about the panel, like that we used to be more diverse, and you know, are there other people that will be joining the panel? So just so everyone knows, if you know other people, we are a panel of religious leaders in Steamboat. That's part of our mission statement. It's just how we formed and who we are. We are open to leaders of all faiths. And we usually have Steve Agner, who represents Islam, and unfortunately he couldn't be with us tonight. So he's another perspective that we have on the panel, but we do have representation, obviously, from Christianity, from Judaism, from Buddhism, A Course in Miracles, and then we usually have Steve, who represents Islam. So we are open to other faith traditions or other people being a part of the panel if they're a religious leader in Steamboat. So if there's other, if you know of other people who would have some interest in our group, feel free to give them our contact information. But, we also acknowledge that being religious leaders in Steamboat, that's a pretty small group too. There's not a ton of diversity in that. So we get it, that it would be nice to have more diversity, but. Any other questions or any comments? And again, I appreciate all of the comments in the chat. I was trying to keep up as the conversation was going, but a lot of you have a lot of great things to say and contributions to the conversation. So if anyone wants to form any of your comments into a question or would like to speak, here's your chance.
Maybe you could read some of the comments, Marshall.
Sure. And some of them were as we were going through, I think. Oh, I think Joanne read that one.
I was thinking, the distinction that one of the commentators made about the distinction between self-righteous and righteousness. I think that would be an interesting thing to parse a little bit. Like, obviously, self-righteous, if I'm standing on my own and I know I'm right and you're wrong, that's a self-righteousness. That's sort of an alienating, exclusive position. But righteousness is something that could be pursued with a group. Like each one of us has a faith community and we're pursuing it together, as a group. So we're not self-righteous individually, me against you, but it's sort of like together we're pursuing what we think is right, but we're also pursuing relationship, or we wouldn't be religious leaders. Religion is something that develops because more than one person has a faith perspective, and so they come together and it's a social thing. So we're sort of trying to do both, I think. We're pursuing relationship, but we're also pursuing righteousness or doing goodness or doing the right thing, or just trying to be moral. But we're doing it together as a group. So I just was thinking about that. Self-righteousness is, I think, seen as kind of a negative thing, but righteousness in a community, moving together and listening to each other and talking and sharing and growing together can happen within the context of a relationship. It can be a both and.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, so some of the other comments, someone said to give dignity to others that have their own thoughts, feelings, emotions, and beliefs. Treat with kindness and respect. Easier said than done. Someone else said that beliefs have implications. We can't legally hold people accountable for what they believe, but rather for what they do based on their beliefs. As a friend, we can talk through beliefs with people we see different ways with, and certain parts of society are meant to hold people accountable for actions that affect others negatively, which are coming from their beliefs.
Can I ask a question? Yeah. Go back just a little bit to that to the Tim's piece. So white supremacy, which is something that seems to be coming up more often now, or more out in the open, or I don't know what the case about that is, but when there's something like that that clearly would violate the moral code of many people. So if that bubbles up in society, what do you do with that? To Tim's comment, I don't think it's the kind of thing you want to say, oh, well, you believe that? Okay, well, that's nice that you believe, there's a place of like saying no, that something's not okay. And I think I think if we all agree on all this stuff we talk about, that's fine. But I think the trouble comes when the church down the street are white supremacists and open and proud of it. What do we do with that? And by the way, church down the street is Holy Name. So- and they're not white supremacists. So that was a metaphor. Or it's St. Paul's the other way, Joanne. And
Yeah, right.
That's a really good question. Yeah, I mean, at what point does tolerance become cooperation with evil? You know, just because we're trying to, accept everyone. You got to draw the line somewhere, and that comes back to as what I was saying earlier. There has to be an objective goodness, an objective morality that's bigger than all of us, or it's everyone for themselves and everyone's own interpretation, and everyone just keeps splintering and fighting because there's nothing over it all. There's no giver of the morality, if you will, from a God perspective, or there's no innate morality in all human beings that if we dig deep enough, we find it. I mean, that's, coming from a Christian perspective and a Catholic perspective, I would say God put that morality in all of our hearts for us to discover, not so much to create or decide, but to discover. It's in us.
So we've talked many times about the importance to work with youngsters on their critical intelligence and to try to raise their discernment about whether something is right or wrong. We just don't, I don't know, I haven't been in school in a while, but my guess is that we just don't talk about it a lot,
And I think
to find an innate sort of moral compass when one is young.
Yeah, I think we have to be able to say white supremacy is wrong.
Yep.
Period.
We evolve as a society, 100, 200 years ago, a certain part of the country didn't believe it was wrong, but we've evolved and we can look at it and say, absolutely, it's wrong. Yeah.
I think part of this goes to belonging, and we want to belong. And so if the bigger community of belonging, whether it's at a humanity level, a national level, I think a lot of people believe that what can I do on my own? But when the group says this is not acceptable, and it's interesting, if you look at climate, there's a political side that sort of wants to deny it. And yet the car industries and many industries of their own are beginning to deal with the issue because a lot of the purchasers, a lot of the consumers care about the environment. And so this goes back to what Scott was saying. Everybody benefits when you want to purchase things that are, sustainable, and that creates new jobs and new industry, and it makes the people that are buying it. And so it's acting from that morality, but acting as a large group and slowly putting some pressure on something that works past the zero-sum game that is in everybody's favor. I mean, with the Black Lives Matter, all of it, it's not as if you were a person of color and you didn't know this was going on, but all of a sudden a lot more people got verbal about it. And is it going to change overnight? No, but every time it happens, people get upset and people get more serious about it. And you're seeing, police forces around the country, things have got to change, and there's a serious momentum. So I think somehow, it's about creating that relationship, but that relationship that pushes back and says, that's not okay, that is going to be our demise, that we are all in this together, whether it's climate, whether it's social, whether it's political, and, and we keep pushing for that mutually beneficial outcome because it's not zero sum.
Yeah. We've got another question here to get to. Can you share personal examples of how communities can work together? Because there are as many different views as people. Margaret Wheatley's caring principles come to mind. For example, let's investigate this issue with our children and grandchildren in mind. So personal examples of how communities can work together, considering that they all have, as many different views.
I know that, in the years talking about community, a very, very small community, a monastic community that I ran for some years. And the basis of that community was friendship. And we took time, we ritualized taking time to listen to each other about how their life was on any given day. And when you know someone, you naturally watch out for them. You don't harm them. You do what you can to benefit from them. That's the way it is. The great Abraham Lincoln said, if you meet someone you don't like, you just don't know them well enough. So for me, having a quality of knowing each other is the basis for everything.
Any other examples?
Well, that's the idea of congregation, isn't it? Tim and Ernest, and Scott. I mean, isn't that the whole point of developing a
But it's a
heartfelt
question
community?
about different communities working together, I think. For example, here in Steamboat, we do have a ministerial association of the different Christian churches. We have done some things together. I mean, our communities have done some things together here, the Thanksgiving celebration, that would be an example. She's asking about different types of communities working together for a common purpose, I think, right?
It's more like, how do you bring, it sounds like to me, how do you bring people with lots of different views together in community? Create community with people with different views.
But I think I just talked about that with the march. I think you just do it and let people come on. It's you move from that call to justice, that compassion, and it does grow.
Yeah.
It takes action. It takes stepping out there and taking a risk and saying, I believe.
Yeah, maybe just one more question then. Is it possible to develop relationships where we could ask a white supremacist, what makes you afraid? What is threatened? What is the loss that you fear? Very personal questions that require relationship to even ask. Requires compassionate person or persons to begin the exploration.
So it actually makes me it makes me think of the book that probably a lot of people may have read, The Rising Out of Hatred, which is, and if you haven't read it, it's a great book, worth checking out. The premise is, it's a story of a young man who was raised in, I think technically it's the white nationalist movement, which apparently is distinct from the white supremacy movement. But he was kind of he was their star. He was like the up and coming star of, the white nationalist movement. And he goes to college and he ends up hanging out with, Jewish people and people of color and all these different people who he had been told for his whole life were a certain way and, did certain things and acted a certain way and were essentially the enemy. And the longer he spent with these different people, the more he kind of came to understand the flawed nature of the white nationalist thinking. And so, I think there is, yes, I think it's possible. I don't think it's something that's necessarily easy. And I think that it would, not every person, there may be, people who identify as white supremacists who would be open to having that conversation. I don't know how many. Maybe it's not fair that I would guess probably not that many. But you never know. And it may be that if someone were asked, that it would be a question that they'd never really considered before. And the asking of the question could not only start a conversation, but kind of start a process of self-reflection that could lead to something powerful. But I think, the kind of the flip side of this is, how many of us are open to asking those questions, and then staying in that dialogue, even if we are really, even if we find the initial responses deeply problematic, are we willing to stick with it? Are we willing to kind of push beyond just the superficial answers that a person may give to really dig into that? And that, and that, going back to what kind of where we started, that comes with relationship, right? I mean, if you're in a situation where you have the opportunity to know someone, then you are in a better place to kind of engage with those questions. Whether a person might be receptive to those kinds of questions. So yeah, I guess it kind of brings it back full circle to the need to be in relationship with others, and to sometimes translate that relationship into conversation, but that goes beyond the basic, and really digs into deep and serious things. And I would hope that a conversation like that would result in growth for all involved, that it takes the right people in the right place in the right time.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for answering that. So we're just coming to the end of our time here tonight. So I want to thank all of you who participated. In the audience, I know it's hard. We miss being able to see your faces and gather in person, and this is kind of the next best thing. But it was really great to see all the comments in the chat throughout the conversation, and hopefully you felt a part of it. We want to create a sense of community with all of you as well. And it's just a little harder to do with this format. But again, we appreciate you being a part of this. If you would like to share this with others who were unable to attend tonight, it will be up on our Facebook page, and I'll have it up on our website in the next couple days here, exploringthesacred.org. And also, if anyone wants to contribute to Exploring the Sacred to support events like this, I just put in the chat a link to our donation page. If you want to be on our email list, if for some reason you are not, you can also do that at our website under maybe contact. I think it's under contact. You can put your email in, and we will only advertise our events when we come up. We do these every couple of months on different topics once we feel like we have something to offer. And if you have any ideas about what we should be talking about, feel free to you can put it in the chat tonight, or feel free to shoot us an email on the contact page. So thank you to our leaders as well for being a part of this, many of you for many, many years, and for being a part of it each month. So thank you all for being here tonight, and have
Thank you, Marshall and Tim.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Tim,
Marshall.
Michelle.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Be
Okay.
well, be
guys.
safe. Much
Have
love
a
to
good
everybody
evening.
out
Bye-bye.
there.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
See you.